I might have to hold that because I don't think that's going to go that high for me. I'll take that, thank you. Thanks, Lynn, thanks for the introduction, and thank you, David, for putting this together. I was just thinking about, it's really about time we've had one of these. Someone made the comment earlier that typically for a forum like this, you have to head over east, but just looking across and the conversations we've been having during the break, it's great to have such a coalition of the willing from those who are the actual developers. We've got the policy makers, and then we've got the scientists in the room. So I think it is a really special event to have together. I think it was a little bit disingenuous, David, though. You probably should have had the subtext for this forum to say that it was actually a Department of Agriculture reunion as well. Because I just have a show of hands. Who's actually worked for the Department of Agriculture or still working for the Department of Agriculture? Yeah, there's some people not willing to put their hand up, but I actually think it's about half the team here. So it's good to see that it's a good incubator for some good thinking. Thanks, Don. So what my brief this morning, or this afternoon rather, is really just to touch on some of the economics. And I guess the beauty of being towards the end of the day is a lot of the hard work's already been done through my presentation. So I'll actually probably just fill in the gaps that haven't already been covered, because Harley Lacey's actually after me, and I know when he gets passionate about something, he'll probably take up the rest of the time. So I might give you 5 minutes of my time, Harley, towards the end. Specifically, I'll just really go through what do we know in and around the economics, and also touch on the accounting and science component, what we don't know, and then really just tying that together, which some of the conversations have already had around what do we actually need to do to realise the potential. And I might just briefly flag, my involvement in the carbon story really started back when I first came across to the west about 12 years ago. Based out of Meekatharra, so I spent 5 years there, and I spent a lot of time driving around looking at country like this. My brief was looking at how could we really seek to assist pastoralists to continue to operate their pastoral leases, and both from an improvement in land condition, but also just around the underlying basics of maintaining cash flow. And to be honest, there continue to be pockets of really good land management out there. There's businesses that are still making 20% ROI out there, but they are the exception rather than the rule. So for me, it was around we need a mechanism, and Freddie touched on it earlier today. We need large swaths of cash to be able to restore these areas back to where they need to be, and not to restore it just so it's a lock and leave, but to be able to restore it to allow us to then continue to sustainably graze the land now and into the future. And this next slide is probably the one that some of you may have seen. It to me, it's probably outdated, but it's probably still representative of what we're looking at. And really, when I have these sort of numbers, I look at it as an investment prospectus around what the current land condition is, and land condition really acts as a surrogate, if you like, for stocks of carbon. So if you look at across the state, the Kimberley and the Pilbara are still relatively in good condition. So in terms of their baseline of carbon, how much sequestration potential there is there, it's relatively minimal. And then really, as many of you from the Murchison here would know, that it's due to the lower rainfall. That's I often think that in the Kimberley Pilbara, your sins get washed away every year when the rains come, or in the Gascoyne Murchison being a lot lower rainfall of region, if that level of degradation, its resilience is much lower. So when we're talking about where's the economic opportunity, it's really in the Gascoyne Murchison. That's where I'd be looking for as a project developer. Peter Russell touched on this already, but there already has been quite a lot of work, and this is around what we know. Probably the piece of work that really was a light bulb moment for me was, if you haven't met John Law from Mine Rehabilitation Services, based in Kalgoorlie. So he was probably, I think, really the pioneer in carbon accounting, and I actually think globally I haven't seen a piece of work this robust in semi-arid rangelands anywhere in the world. So it was a piece of work that was done over a decade, a lot of PhD. It was, I think, 3 or 4 PhDs, a number of papers written, and it was about 5 or 6 masters done out of that piece of work alone. And that was done in the Goldfields, which is really looking at, can we grow carbon, how much carbon is there, and how quickly does it sequester? The other work that was done by Pauline Grierson and Mark Adams up in the Pilbara, so that was again work that fed into a lot of the national accounting process. So there's a lot of algorithms that have been developed for a lot of trees throughout the Pilbara region. And then there was a piece of work that I was involved in with a group when I was based up in Kununurra, where we had 3 pastoral leases where we did the full baseline carbon accounting and looked at some different scenarios in terms of intensification, looking at bringing large amounts of infrastructure to really drive the system harder, through to a real passive approach. So we ran the numbers on that to see what do the economics look like on it. And then there was, since I left the department, there's been some other work from Richard Glover and Peter Russell and others who have done, again, more targeted studies at individual stations. So we get this growing body of data around knowing, one, how much carbon is there, and then also what are the sort of things we would do in order to sequester that. Peter's already touched on this, but I think running the economic lens over it, it's a way to think about you've got the different carbon pools in the landscape, and it's really about understanding each one of those are an asset. And so it's about, when you're talking about packaging a project up, which ones are the bankable, your blue ribbon type assets, the ones that have low variability versus the ones that are much more volatile. To Don's question before, the pools around your herbaceous litter and your grasses, they're much more seasonally dependent as opposed to your above ground stocks, which are much more bankable if you're looking at doing a project because they're not as influenced by fire and grazing. So this is just some of the numbers that actually came out of the carbon capture project from the Kimberley Pilbara. So these are in CO2e, so not tonnes of carbon. This is the currency that's used if you're looking at trading a project. So it gives you a bit of an idea of the spread. So we ran over a number of different land systems. So you're looking at, say, for Chila Plains, so we've got Evan Pansini here. This is his pastoral lease that was involved in the project. 100 tonnes of CO2e per hectare, and up to an open woodland, so you've got grass and trees in the Kimberley, and that's in excess of 300 tonnes per hectare. So this is the amount of carbon that's there now. So this is not highlighting that this is the potential. It'll depend on where the actual landscape is, will determine what your sequestration potential is. So if we've got, say for the Kennedy land system, something that's been half degraded, we've lost half the trees, or we've got a lot of the grasses that have been lost, then it's about then working out where you are on that trajectory to determine what your sequestration potential is. Sorry, the other point, you heard Peter talking about error bars, and it's usually scientists who love error bars. So for those who are probably not familiar with it, so this is an error bar here. So this is saying that this is the average level of carbon in this particular land system, plus or minus that. So obviously, if you're going in and engaging in a project, you want to make sure that if I'm trading with you, you want to be fairly certain that I'm giving you 100 tonnes plus or minus a small percentage. The bigger the error bar, the more uncertainty there is that I'm going to be giving you that 100 tonnes, which is a really important point, particularly in a landscape that is quite variable. So this is, again, what we know. This is some of the numbers that actually came out of the Sturt Meadows work. So this shows you, again, the level of variability that you'd expect in a semi-arid system. So you can see in something where we've got a landscape that looks like that, you can have as low as, again, this is in CO2e, something basically negligible, through to something that's got a large amount of above ground stocks and soil carbon. So I beg your pardon, this is just total above ground carbon. So if you draw a line through the middle of that, where you've got a landscape which is open run-on and run-off areas throughout the Goldfields, you'd be looking at 98 tonnes per hectare. So if you're kind of, again, just at a high level looking at what is the potential, there's been probably in the last 10 years a number of studies, and to be honest, a lot of the numbers are basically rehashed from the original estimates. And probably the ones that I always come back to was the CSIRO and the Roscano, because I still see those were probably the real anchor reports, which quoted, and this is at a $10 per tonne hectare is what I've applied those to. That's Australia-wide. The report that came out from Outback Ecology, that was working on an estimate. If we worked on an average of 1.9 million hectares in the Murchison, which we know is in poor condition, so has a potential for sequestration, at an average of 30 tonnes per hectare, again, bearing in mind it'll be plus or minus, but if you take a fairly conservative estimate, at $10 a tonne in the voluntary market, you could be looking at 57 million over 30 years. So it's not... Sorry, what did I say? 57, sorry, 570, thanks, Sally. So it's actually not big numbers over... But again, and I think that's where the market is really going to determine how big the numbers get fairly quickly. There's been a number of different studies which we did previously within the department and after leaving, doing on individual landholders. The ROI that we came out on for most of those was around 10 to 15%. And that was looking at tweaking the balance between carbon farming as well as continuing with the ongoing livestock production enterprise. I think from my perspective, that's a really important point when we're talking about carbon farming, because for me, it's about actually just getting the external capital to restore the rangelands, and then we know that income's only going to be for 30 years, so we need an ongoing stream of cash flow to ensure that carbon asset remains in place for the next 70 years. And that's, I know Harley will be touching on the social component, but that's really the important part of it. And I guess for me personally, it's one of the things why I'm quite interested to actually see this initiative get going. The other part I just touch on too is that seasons drive change in the rangelands. So particularly what we've found with a lot of the work we've done is grazing and fire and earthworks or some form of active restoration certainly has an impact, but it's really, particularly in the rangelands, will be the seasons that'll drive that. And there's a lot of really good work that really shows that if you had to weight it, it'd probably be a 70 to 80% impact. Seasons really determine the trajectory of where the landscape's going. Management has a 20% impact, but that 20% is really quite an important part, because that is, I guess, the part we only have control over. And I think this one's probably, I know about 4 or 5 years ago, that was probably one that was really quite topical, but I think, to be honest, I'm not hearing as much noises about that anymore, because I think we've matured in understanding that carbon farming, particularly in a rangeland setting, is not mutually exclusive from conservation. So just going into the parts that we don't know, and I guess I would look at this more from a carbon developer, or if you're a pastoral leaseholder, around, when you're looking at a project, it's around what are the things I have control over and what are the things that I can influence. The things that I'd say that we don't know but are inside our control, I think, are looking at knowing what I've used the term carbon atlas of WA rangelands. Peter touched on the fact before that we've got a pretty good library now of probably what would be the higher value land systems and their sequestration potential, but there's still quite a large number that haven't been baselined yet. And that's really the question of, do we go to the effort? Is that something that the government's interested in wanting to really baseline to know exactly what is the value of the entire WA rangelands estate? Or is that something that we know enough now, and then we let the private developers actually go in and start to drive the market? Because once the money starts to be made, there'll be interest to go after more and more data, so it'll allow the market to fund the science as opposed to the government continuing to have that control over that. I would say the other part is, Peter mentioned this before, the recovery periods and the related costs. I think we have enough information to start now, to start a project, but there is still a few unknowns in terms of whether it's the seasons, whether it's the actual cost. It's not until you actually execute a project on the ground that a lot of those unknowns around the real cost of whether it be an earthworks project or sequestering carbon through a different grazing management. But I think from my perspective, it's a bit of that learning by doing rather than waiting. We should actually start now. And I think the other parts have already been discussed by some of the other speakers. I think there's still a bit of uncertainty, but I do think as an industry, we certainly can influence the policy direction and the approvals pathway. I think it's pretty telling that there's still a lot of interest, but no one's actually put a project on the table, and I think it's only until someone steps forward and puts a project on the table that'll actually give the impetus to actually start to put some of that detail around it. And then this is one that I guess Lynn is probably interested in, and around the impacts of climate change. It's one of those ones which there's a lot of models that suggest which way it'll go, but it's something that I would argue is outside our control, outside our influence. And so it's perhaps something that we don't necessarily need to worry about in actually getting a project going. So in terms of what do we need to actually realise the potential, what I would say is I use the word easy project, and what I mean by easy is that you saw on the previous slide, with some of the land systems you've got variability in excess of 50% within a particular area. So I'd be targeting those land systems which we know have high sequestration potential and very limited variability in those stocks over time. So it actually just makes the science of accounting very easy. With the legal aspects, again, I'd be looking at whether it is an Indigenous corporation themselves starting the project or a pastoral lease where there is already an existing very good relationship with an Indigenous corporation. So that component, the legality of it is fairly easy, because from my perspective, it's really just about getting one or two projects up in WA that'll actually set the precedent for all the others to come behind. So it's about trying to limit the amount of things that we can't control and can't influence. Many of you will be aware of the R.M. Williams project that the Feds got behind a number of years ago. And I think that was a really missed opportunity for the industry, because I think that what that did was solidify some of the biases or preconceptions by some of the administrators that, look, we told you with this project, the rangelands carbon is not something that can be done. So for Western Australia, I think it's really important that the first project we get off the ground is an easy project. It's a no-brainer from a landscape and legal point of view, so that the first one gives people the confidence that yes, it can be done. Yes, there is support from the state to invest. The second part is I use the word firewall carbon enterprise from policy changes. So we've heard today that there's so much turbulence in the compliance market, and I don't think that's, perhaps it's a cynic in me, but I don't know whether that's ever going to change. I think because you're always going to be, the carbon, unlike most other commodities, is almost purely reliant on government policy. It's not reliant on the demand for iron ore or for petroleum. So in that sense, it's about trying to create an enterprise that is insulated from that. And that's about looking at continuing with the grazing enterprise, looking at sandalwood, looking at other enterprises within the entity that you're using, such that if there is a change in government and the price collapses, you're not vulnerable. And I guess Kent Broad, who'll be speaking a little bit later, he'll be able to share some insights into how that can be done, both in the agricultural area and then looking at what we can do in the rangelands. So particularly where we're at now, it's a pretty high stakes round because there are still quite a few unknowns. I think the legal one is out there. I've got probably a little bit more bullish than others in terms of the verification counting and knowing what we can sequester. But it is still a high risk round. So I think there's a responsibility from the state government, and I guess also for some of the major corporates to actually get in there and de-risk this initially, because I think there's a large number of other co-benefits that can be generated from it. So it's almost like a no-regret spend, really, in that sense. It was mentioned earlier, so we still don't, the Rangelands carbon methodology hasn't been approved and endorsed. There is one that has been, it was basically kind of 75% there from what I understand. It was actually one that I was involved in writing when I was working for Outback Ecology. So the framework's there. It's again just about having someone who's got a project, who's got some real dollars behind them to actually just take that one all the way through to the finish line. And then the last point, I guess, is one of those ones which is about channeling the WA entrepreneurial spirit. I think I'm actually a Queenslander, which I don't know whether it's a safe place to declare that here, but so I've been in the West for 12 years, and one of the reasons why I'm still here is because it doesn't matter what sector or industry you're involved in, it's got that real can-do attitude, and there's a lot of opportunity here. And I think it's one of those things where the way I kind of see the process at the moment, there's a lot of us standing on the sides on the dance floor, and no one's willing to be that first person to put themselves out there and actually get the party started. So I think it's one of those things where it's about you're backing ourselves, and I think that's particularly where the state and corporates can actually come in behind those first movers to really take us forward to that first project. And I'll leave you with this quote. I'll read it to you because I think it is pretty important. So it's merely a district of fertile plains which will, I believe and hope, be suitable for pastoral purposes, and in its most northern portion, the future for tropical culture. But those who venture into its development will have to incur a large expenditure, and in getting their stock to the country have much trouble and difficulty in years of toil under a tropical sun before they make their fortunes. And they require the easiest terms and conditions. So this is an excerpt from, I would say probably one of the best, the well-known statesmen of Western Australia, Sir John Forrest, in his report back to the Surveyor General after looking at the Kimberley region. And I see so many parallels of where we're standing now as an industry to where, to what it was back then, where there's a lot of unknowns. You can imagine back in that colonial Perth, we don't really know what's up in the Kimberley. We've got some maps, but we're not 100% sure. But it comes back to that WA entrepreneurial spirit that there was a decision made. The government committed funds to actually say, look, there is high risk, but there's also high gains to be made. And you think that by doing that, it's the development of the Kimberley pastoral industry has allowed many other sectors to basically leverage off that. And I think that's really what the carbon industry will do for the WA rangelands. And I'm being told to sit down, so... And I didn't give Harley any additional time either, did I? Oh, sure. Yeah, well, I'm actually just closing up. So, particularly when we're talking about the carbon industry, I think that the comment, I can't remember who mentioned it this morning, but there's a whole number of other sub-sectors that it will actually grow once you actually start to get that external capital coming back into the region. So, yep, I'm done.